What's happening, everybody? I'm Todd Tanner. This is Wrestling News Now. Tonight, I want to talk about one of the all time greats, one of the pioneers, one of the African American pioneers in the world of professional wrestling, Thunderbolt Patterson. Let's get right down to it. Claude Patterson was born on the 8th of July, 1941. And he is an American retired professional wrestler, African American wrestler, might I add. Ring name that he used during his heyday was Thunderbolt Patterson. He began his career in 1964 and wrestled primarily in Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. During the early 1970s, he was blacklisted by the National Wrestling Alliance for repeated appearances with independent promotions, complaints of institutional racism, and attempts to form a wrestlers' labor union. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes you pay the price for having to do what is right. Patterson had grown up in Iowa and worked for John Deere in Waterloo, Iowa, when he broke into professional wrestling in the Kansas City area. Promoter Gus Carras put Patterson in matches against Don Soto in 1964. In 1965, Patterson moved to Texas and worked with promoter Dory Funk Sr. The following year, he traveled to California, where he held the WWA Tag Team Championship with Alberto Torres. He also continued to work in Texas, where he worked as a villainous character in Dallas until he was turned on by his partner Boris Malenko. Fritz Von Erich had a Russian chain match with Malenko for Patterson's contract, which Malenko owned. In 1969, he worked for Big Time Wrestling in Michigan and Ohio. In 1970, Patterson feuded with Jose Lothario and held the Florida version of the NWA Brass Knuckles Championship. Patterson agreed to work for an outlaw promotion, that is, one outside of the NWA, run by Ann Gunkel, the widow of his old friend and Georgia promoter Ray Gunkel in the 1970s. He also spoke out against poor working conditions for wrestlers and sued for racial discrimination, and as a result he was blacklisted from wrestling. He had been complaining about racism from promoters for many years. He would later recall that only Dory Funk Sr. had backed him and wanted to start a wrestlers union, a dream he shared with former NFL player and wrestler Jim Wilson, himself blacklisted. It would be years with Patterson working at the Los Angeles Times in the interim before he would get another shot when Dusty Rhodes took ill in Florida. In 1976, he won the NWA Florida Heavyweight Championship from Bruiser Brody. In 1977, he scored a surprise pinfall over the Sheik in Toronto for the U.S. title, but lost 3 weeks later. Patterson joined Ole Anderson as a tag team partner in the early 1980s, and they briefly held the NWA National Tag Team Championship. Ole's cape-faced nephew, a young Arn Anderson, came to the sport, and Ole saying he was tired of carrying guys like Patterson and Dusty Rhodes. Broke up with Patterson and joined Arn in what would be the foundation for the Four Horsemen, which would include NWA Heavyweight Champion Ric Flair and Tully Blanchard. Patterson retired from the ring in 1993. His last match was at Slamboree 93, where he teamed with Brad Armstrong to defeat Ivan Koloff and Baron von Raschke. He would also mentor Ice Train until retiring completely in 1994. On July 27th, 2019, Patterson was inducted into the 2019 class of the George Tragos Luther's Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in his hometown of Waterloo. Patterson is regularly mentioned by commentators Kevin Kelly and Steve Corino on the Ring of Honor Wrestling Promotions, Ring of Honor Wrestling syndicated television program. In 1998, Patterson was a labor organizer for Service Employees International Union in Atlanta. After retiring from professional wrestling, he began running a Christian camp for children. Patterson is also an ordained minister. So let's talk for a few moments about the championship held by Thunderbolt Patterson. Thunderbolt Patterson held the Championship Wrestling from Florida, or the NWA Brass Knuckles Championship from Florida, one time. He was the NWA Florida Heavyweight Champion one time, the Continental Wrestling Association World Heavyweight Champion one time, George Thurgos, Luther's Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame. He was inducted, or he received the Luther's Award in 2019. And in Georgia Championship Wrestling, he held the NWA Georgia Tag Team Championship 3 times with Mr. Wrestling, Tommy Rich, and Tony Atlas, Mr. USA. He also held the NWA Georgia Television Championship on 2 occasions. The NWA National Tag Team Championship with Ole Anderson he held 1 time. The International Championship in International Championship Wrestling, he was the ICW United States Heavyweight Champion 1 time. Maple Leaf Wrestling, the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship, that's the Toronto version, he held 1 time. In the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling area, the NWA Atlantic Coast Tag Team Champion with Jerry Briscoe. And also he held the NWA American Tag Team Championship 4 times with Wahoo McDaniel, Toru Tanaka, and Johnny Valentine. He held the NWA Brass Knuckles Championship, which was the Tri-State version, 1 time. And he was also the NWA Brass Knuckles Championship Amarillo version 1 time, which was the Western State Sports. In the World Wrestling Association, or the WWA, he held the World Tag Team Championship 1 time with Alberto Torres. He's more than just a wrestler. He's a man who's on a mission, one to be respected, one to be admired, trailblazer, pioneer, organizer. If you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. For Wrestling News Now, I'm Todd Tanner.